Hello everyone, welcome to day, I've actually lost track a little bit, somewhere in the early hundreds, maybe around day 109, day 110. If this is your first time here, my name is Andrew Loren, and this is a series that I do where I track my everyday art progress and my development as an artist. So for today's drawing, I'm actually going back to a concept that I've been exploring in some really recent works, which is this idea of trying to master halftones. So in the last couple months, I've really been working a lot on training my accuracy, training my understanding of anatomy, training my arm for quick sketch, training my sensitivity to proportions, and really trying to capture accuracy and realism out of a subject. But what I haven't spent as much time on is this idea of rendering. I've kind of played with it a little bit. So for example, on day 100, and I think slightly after that, I did a couple drawings where I was trying to just render simple shapes and explore simple shapes, which is a great exercise, by the way, as like a quick aside for trying to master halftones. But what I really want to do is kind of bring together a lot of this accuracy work that I've been doing and proportions work and studies of the figure and of the portrait, and bring that together a little bit more with this idea of trying to master halftones. So what I ended up doing today was actually, believe it or not, roughly like an hour and 45 minutes, maybe even close to 2 hours of drawing, and drawing this portrait from this reference that I found on the Pinterest board that's kind of linked below. And I was really trying to kind of emphasize this idea of halftones. So one of the things that I recently learned, I've kind of been consuming a lot of different art courses and also learning a little bit from an instructor. I take classes at the Art Students League of New York, and this idea of separating your lights from your darks. So if you imagine like a full value scale, like from 1 to 10, and you can think of 1 as being like the lightest highlight that you have access to. It could be the color of your paper, or maybe even have like toned paper and a white colored pencil. And then on the 10 is the other extreme, which would be the darkest dark. So the whatever your darkest pencil is, it's pushing it down as hard as you can and going over it as many times as you can. And the idea is that you want to use in a good drawing, I think, as much of this value range as you possibly can. And the important thing that with halftones is that you are separating, first of all, you're giving yourself enough of those values to be in your halftone region, but you shouldn't think of halftones, in my opinion, as a monolith, or this is at least the exercise that I've been doing. I break down my halftones into 2 different groups. There's the light halftones and the dark halftones. And the immediate instinct, I think, is to say something like, well, okay, if our lightest light is 1 and our darkest dark is 10, then all of our halftones should be 5, like the value 5. And this is kind of how I had always thought about halftones, and actually how I've been working with them quite a bit. But what I realized recently, in order to get kind of better realism out of my drawings and better rendering, is that I actually now group my halftones, as I said, into either light halftones or dark halftones. So now the values of my drawings are something more like 1, 2, 4, and those are the light halftones, and then the dark halftones would be something like 7, 8, and then 10 being the dark. So I still have this full value range of the 1 and 10, but my halftones are really concentrated on either side. And for me, this has been helping a lot with rendering and a lot with just kind of adding to the realism of the drawing. And so today's drawing was really all about emphasizing that, just trying to think entirely about this idea of halftones. And I must say, it was a struggle. I did go back and forth, and I had to spend a lot of time kind of pushing these values. There were times where my darks were too light, there were times where my lights were too dark. Eventually my halftones got too dark. It became actually difficult to distinguish where the halftones were with respect to the darks. So I would say, like, if we're going back to that number scale, all of my halftones were 7, 8, and 9, and I had no light halftones. And so ultimately, actually, I'm not sure how much of a success the drawing was in terms of what I set out to accomplish. I think I did get a lot of mental practice with this kind of value range and with thinking about halftones and starting to master them and doing these kinds of exercises. But what I think I'm lacking a little bit still is the execution of that. So in the end, I think that there's a lot of contrast in this piece, and actually the halftones are not super present. Actually, on some level, they could even be deleted out of the drawing, and I'm not really sure how much it would change. Just because in the end, I pushed so much of the shadow and really only left a little bit of different features, like around, on the cheek, underneath the chin, and a little bit on the forehead for halftones. One other thing on halftones that I didn't remember actually until after I finished this piece is this idea of fall off. And I learned this from Chris Legospe, who is an incredible artist for teaching and one of the best resources I think out there on YouTube. So Chris Legospe, highly recommended. But one of the concepts he talks about is this idea of fall off, which is like if you imagine the oval shape of the face as an egg, and you can kind of imagine, let's say that the core shadow right now is kind of going along here. Because of the way that, you know, an egg is situated in space or sits in space relative to the light, the bottom of the face will always be darker, and so will this side always be darker. So your lightest highlights should actually be, if the lighting is from above, which it always is when you're dealing with figures and portraits, then your lightest highlights should always be around the forehead and maybe a little bit, you know, on these high cheekbones. Otherwise, everything else should kind of fade off or fall off into a little bit of like a halftone or a darker value. So this is something that I kind of forgot about, that if I was going to go back in and do more work, this is something that I would kind of mess with or try and change. So that's everything for today. I recommend practicing this idea of, you know, keeping your halftones really divided if you really want to master them. And we'll also go back to some little rendering studies where we do, for example, the egg, or we do some simple shapes, just to kind of like reinforce a little bit the separation of the value range. But that's everything for today. I will see you soon for the next day.